So, our job as Sea Grant agents is we provide sort of science-based education on coastal topics. We have specialists anywhere from, sustainable fishing, seafood, resiliency, sea level rise, marine debris. I do a lot of sustainable fishing programs as well as invasive species. So, my background is I was a weird lizard kid growing up. I worked at reptile farms, the exotic animal trade. I went to grad school for hormonal induction spawning of freshwater ornamental fish. So a lot of the things I know near and dear to my heart are things that, you might see in the environment now. Florida has about 500 non-native wildlife species that have been found, just scattered around. A lot of those come from the pet trade and then about 1,500 non-native plants. So in this presentation, we're going to learn about terminology, what is an invasive species, because there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, how and why they got here, what kind of impacts they make ecologically and environmentally, what we can do to really make a difference, some common species profiles of invaders you might have seen in the news or around, and what we do with Sea Grant and this fish roundup that actually help lead with our SISMA group that got some attention from Keep Florida Beautiful, and hopefully we'll be able to partner in the near future and create lasting impacts. So without further ado, I will proceed. This is myself and my 4-year-old daughter at the time. She's now 9, and we'd go cane toad busting during the pandemic. And it was a fun time to, send your daughter out in the yard and grab a toad because it's hard to yell at her compared to a mid 30-year-old man trying to pick up frogs in your front yard. So let's get to it. So this within the first like month or two of me making this presentation, I just saw so many headlines in the newspapers and online media. Florida invasive species. Now they're in Georgia. What is that? A Cuban tree frog? That's not the United States, right? Oh, there are new species potentially identified because there's a bunch of science going out there of, like what can we do to prevent other species from becoming established that might have these same invasive characteristics. Florida's ground zero for an invasive species. What is that plant? There's iguanas falling from the sky. If you go in the newspaper, including a talk I did to the Marco Island Realtor Group last week, when I was leaving their office, they literally had this right outside, which is talking about Burmese pythons and iguanas. So they're inside, our minds, our papers, our media. So, but what does invasive species mean? And what is an invasive species? So let's get to it. Usually I have a captive audience where I can, see facial features and see if you're thinking or pointing at something, but I'm going to go ahead and do this one myself. So what is an invasive species? We have a raccoon. Look how friendly he looks. Oh, alligator. He's scary, right? Oh, cat with a bird in its mouth. Which one's an invasive species? Well, I'm gonna let it to this definition that's gonna pop up on the screen. An invasive species is a species non-native to a specific geographical area. So, Florida is large. We have over 1,300 miles of coastline, 8,000 miles of tidally influenced coastline. It takes probably about 12 hours to drive from Key West to the Panhandle. So, the geographic range, Peninsular Florida, is a little bit different than like Panhandle, Florida. But invasive is non-native to a geographic area introduced by humans intentionally or unintentionally. What's an unintentional introduction? Well, that could be, a cage getting toppled over during a storm. That could be, shipping cargo. It's just on the outside of something or hitching onto a plant like a hitchhiker instead of, you're actually intending to move that species. And then this is the big one that separates it from becoming non-native. The difference between a non-native species and invasive. It has to cause harm or potentially cause harm to the environment, economy, or humans. So it doesn't have to be all three of those. It could just be one or two of those, and it's a big gray area. There's some that are more damaging than others. Other ones are more maybe on the non-native species side, but we're getting better at quantifying those impacts and trying to, assess the damage that some of these non-native species make that could potentially push them to the invasive threshold. So, by this definition, it says human harm. Hey, can an alligator cause human harm? You don't want to put your hand in there, right? You hear about alligator attacks every now and then. but that's a native species to our area. So, with that kind of invasive characteristics, if it's a native species, it's just considered a nuisance. So think of, a nuisance pelican, a nuisance seagull, a nuisance bear knocking over trash cans, a nuisance alligator. These are more of an individual, not necessarily a species or a population that you might have those negative interactions with, right? Well, this cat is not from here, and cats have been known to eat like up to like I think 1 to 3 billion birds in the United States each year, like 5 to 20 billion small reptiles, amphibians, mammals, bugs. They're one of the most widely distributed predators on Earth because every time somebody had a boat, they probably had a cat to eat the pests, and now they're on a bunch of different islands and have been known to eat up to 2,000 different prey items. So. They're awesome. They're cute and cuddly, but we want to keep them inside to save our native wildlife and reduce that impact. So words on pages. So this is a lot of stuff to handle, but native inside a geographic area, non-native outside a specific geographic area. Introduced, that is something brought by people intentionally or unintentionally released, right? Intentionally could be biological control. Maybe you can't take care of your pet anymore and you let it go. Don't do that. Right? Unintentionally, like I mentioned, it could be a hurricane, it could be ballast water, it could be shipping materials, it could be inside a plant that you wanted to bring into the, state. Established, this is a really big important definition here, and that is a self-sustaining reproducing population. So once they become more of themselves, that becomes a bigger issue because you sort of make a viable case on your environment that could possibly, overcome that reproductive dysfunction. The conditions are just right. The food is there. The eggs can hatch. And once something starts becoming reproductive and you see a small one, a big one, a medium-sized one, there hasn't really been any successful eradication of any established reptile, amphibian, or fish that have been established, that self-reproducing population in our state. And I'm sure we could probably think of some more too with plants. And then nuisance, invasive, like I mentioned, non-native, outside a geographic area, introduced by humans, and then it has to potentially cause harm to the environment, economy, and humans. So I'm going to go over in the species profile of, how you could play devil's advocate of how impactful they are and how invasive they are compared to other kind of species we'll talk about. Nuisance, we talked about, it might have those invasive characteristics, but more so on that individual level of a native species. Okay, so what are some invasive species? Usually this is a good, hey, you, hands up, but plants, a lot of times an invasive plant, or an invasive or non-native animal could have the country origin in the name. So a really common and bad one for our state that our state spends, tens of millions of dollars to try to manage each year is Brazilian pepper. So we're not Brazil, we're in Florida. Okay, we'll talk about this one a little bit later as well. Animals, so mammals, feral hogs, they're in over 35 states, I believe. They cause billions of dollars of agricultural damage. They root around, causing disturbances to natural areas. They can be disease carriers, so really bad one, right? Amphibian, cane toad. These are some of the most cold call received questions I have is this a cane toad and what should I do with it? People are very concerned about the impacts these have on our domestic pets that have not evolved with the cane toad that are really, their poison can affect them greatly and more of a damage to humans in that aspect rather than ecologically damaging. We'll go over that as well a little bit further. Reptiles, many of the lizards you see outside are not native, whether they're, brown anoles or Mediterranean house geckos, tokay geckos. I get a lot of questions about those agamas, the ones that have the orange head and the blue body that look like Superman, amoebas, monitor lizards, tegus. We have so many, right? And we'll talk about some characteristics of invasive that make, reptiles and scaly things a little bit more have a competitive edge on getting established as well. Fish, there's plenty of marine invaders out there, but not as many as actual freshwater invaders. Because you have to think, if you let go of two things in the ocean, what are the likelihoods of them actually meeting each other up, and then reproducing? So, in a gated community, and everybody gets a fish tank during Christmas and lose their interest in it by June. That's, a lot of kids potentially dumping in the same kind of pets they get from Petco and PetSmart and having, cichlids reproducing. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then birds. There's some invasive birds like the monk parrot. There's Muscovy ducks. There's Egyptian geese out there. So we have plenty of invasive species. And really, this was just to talk about, we'll talk about, reptiles, amphibians, and some fish and some plants as well. But invasive species can be anything. It's a non-native organism, right? A lot of that emphasis gets put on the creepy crawly, the reptiles, right? But I just mentioned cats causing a lot more damage than some of those iguanas that eat mostly vegetation and maybe cause some sort of infrastructure stuff, right? But then it could also be pathogens like funguses and bacteria. This little guy, most people would walk past every single day, not even stop, not even bat an eye, but it caused more damage than probably all these combined in our state almost in terms of economic impact. So that is an Asian citrus psyllid, which was responsible for introducing the citrus greening disease. This thing was accidentally introduced on a piece of citrus called a Buddha's hand that was coming in by a visitor and caused this disease that is a bacterial pathogen, I believe, that caused up to $7.8 billion of damage to our state's economy. And losing thousands of jobs to our state. And that impact combined with the impact of hurricanes is really making the citrus industry decline in our state, which we have the orange on our license plate. That's a cultural kind of thing that's near and dear to our heart, but now these are all turning into the housing developments because the impact of both citrus greening plus hurricane disturbances just isn't making it economically viable anymore. So how and why were they introduced? So by definition, invasive species not being here, they have to overcome some sort of barrier. So a lot of times this barrier might be a river, a mountain range, uh, an ocean, something, right? So somebody had to want to traverse it over that area if it's an intruder and to move it to be outside its geographic range. So oftentimes, why would somebody want to move an invasive or a non-native species? Well, they might want to eat it or it's ornamental. So a lot of these come from either agriculture, aquaculture, or ornamental kind of landscaping, pets, all that stuff. Then they had to transport it, right? So they had to think it was worth something to actually move it. They had to introduce it, so that's one barrier for failure. They had to somebody had to go whoops and dump something, or a hurricane had to come over and knock it over, right? And then established, which is that self-reproducing population, and then spread. So, if you're Florida's really inherently special because we have this nice tropical, subtropical environment that's nice. Well, if you were an alligator and you got released in Chicago in the summertime, you're probably fine, but come wintertime, you're going to freeze. So we have an environment that makes it, very pleasant for us, and it makes it very pleasant for a lot of non-native animals and plants to be here. We talked about intentional introductions, so that could be biological control. Sometimes it could just be like, hey, I'm a fan. There's a European starling that you might have seen out west that causes those big murmurs of like clouds of birds moving around. People thought they were cool because they're Shakespeare fans and they released them and now they cause billions of dollars of agricultural damage. Accidental, I'm from Southwest Florida. If you lived on Fort Myers Beach in September of 2022, your fish tank is now dumped into the Gulf. And so in the United States, we have 50,000 non-native species. Most pose little to no threat, but it's one of the leading causes of extinction. About one-third of the animals and plants on the endangered species list are directly impacted by non-native species, and in that case, probably invasive because they have those negative ecological effects. But we need non-native species because it's about 98% of our food supply worth over $800 billion. There's this figure that you might see in papers out there, $120 billion of economic damage each year that invasive species make on our United States economy. A lot of times that is actually underreported because we're quantifying impacts of, um, you know, agriculture and forestry, which is easy to count. You have this amount of food, this invasive species gets introduced. Now we have less of that food, and those are numbers that are recorded, right? You have these ash trees, the emerald ash borer gets introduced. those ash trees are dead. Trees don't run away from you. They're easy to count. Now we can quantify those impacts. But what is the price of a raccoon? What is the price of a wood stork that, we pay a lot of money in tax dollars to, restore habitats. People pay money to go visit Florida's unique ecosystems and, do ecotourism. That's one of the most important things in our local area. Like people come to Collier County to enjoy natural spaces, the beaches, and they could be impacted by invasive species in the future, if we don't manage, control, and, help making our natural spaces still natural. Okay, so some characteristics of invasive species. They don't have to have all these, but these are ones that pop up a lot of times. Whether you're looking at, a plant, uh, a mammal, an amphibian, pathogen, anything, right? So sometimes invasive species have fast growth rates. Maybe they're more reproductively active than some other species in our area, shorter time to reproduction. Maybe they have lots of offspring, like these cane toads. They could lay 8 to 30,000 eggs almost twice per year per individual, right? Or they're great parents. There's some species like cichlids, like tilapia, that are mouth brooders, where the female will lay eggs, the male will fertilize them, the female will put them in their mouth, and you can see like National Geographic videos of, birds, fry coming in and out of a parent fish as protection, right? Our native fish species don't do that. They're good at dispersing. Maybe they, spawn in the water column like these green mussels, and now they're all over the place based on the tides. They could be tolerant of many environments to, maybe that not necessarily lets them live in our area, but let's say if you are trying to live the transport process of getting shipped days or weeks over the, ocean, maybe you have a higher likelihood of becoming released if you could survive that transport, right? Good at using resources, whether you are using low nutrient soils or you could eat omnivorous kind of things like, or carrion, like the roadkill on the side of the road. Lower metabolic needs, reptiles, amphibians, fish are cold-blooded. They don't really use their metabolism's lower than ours because they don't have to maintain their heat. So, a snake could eat, a couple times a year while we have to eat every day pretty much to be in good health and wanting to reproduce. Cryptic coloration, if you blend into the environment, you can sort of hide on boxes underneath plants, get distributed, and then defenses and competition. Some of these things have allelopathic effects, like Brazilian pepper or Australian pine that we'll talk about, where the understory is almost blank because they send off toxins in the ground, either from their leaves dropping or their needles dropping or just, chemical warfare. Lionfish, are venomous. Cane toads are poisonous. Those are all deterrents to, allow them to sort of not get eaten. And then other kind of stuff like this is a mother of million plant. That's a succulent that you can still find at big box stores, which each one of those little leaflets can be an individual plant eventually. So that's a great reproductive strategy for that, but not that great for dune planting on our, coast. So costs, you could have ecological and environmental costs and put them back to back. And, the reason we sort of talk about this is money talks, whether that's helping support legislature to, further research these things, provide money for management of this. So economic costs can be damages to infrastructure. There's some species like zebra mussels that might not really occur in Florida as much, but they could clog up pipes and you have to clean them out. Iguanas have been known to short out power lines. So can our native species as well. Management costs, this is old world climbing fern in Georgia. That looks cool, pretty-ish, but not really because there's not very much diversity there. Imagine all the bugs that need a certain kind of plant or flower out there. Eventually, all these vines will kill those trees. They'll just turn into a field that has not very much biodiversity, not many homes or ecological niches for the animals that evolved to live there. So bad. And then research, there's a lot of money getting allocated towards invasive species research too. Then ecological costs, invasive species can prey upon native species like this lionfish eating this yellowtail snapper that people pay money to go catch over here. Fishing in Florida is worth over $13 billion annually. So, very important to our state, both commercially for seafood products getting exported and people going out there and spending their time, their money, gas to go and catch these fish. Um, Disease transmission, some things can introduce disease, like that Asian citrus psyllid that introduced a citrus greening disease. Other ones like hogs can, I believe, introduce brucellosis. There's other things like the a pentasome, like this worm that affects native snakes that the Burmese python can be a carrier and probable introducer of that parasite. Invasive species can compete, for resources, for land. They can also compete for nesting habitat. They can disturb areas, like I mentioned. And then sort of the hard things to think of is the loss of biodiversity. What's that cost? In our state, tourism's about 10% of our GDP. It saves about $1,800 per household in tax revenue by not having a state income tax. So as these functions and ecosystems start to degrade because of the impacts of invasive species, will we have to pay that in the future? Who knows? And then this is a good chart that just shows that as time goes by, it is very expensive to manage an invasive species and almost impossible. So the most effective and cheapest tool is prevention, and then eradication, which is early detection, rapid response. Important to use that I've Got One app and report your sightings to managers so they can isolate them to prevent them from spreading. And as time goes on, it's very hard, and we sort of have to get used to that new normal. So non-natives in Florida, they like it here, and so do we. So why is Florida so special? It's a tourism and trade hotspot. Like I mentioned, about 50 million people or more come to our state each year. We have about 30 ports of entry. We have 1,300 miles of coastline. We have 6 million tons of perishable cargo come to our state each year. About 85% of non-native plants enter in through Florida that enter in through the United States. About 88% of all flour imports enter in through Florida, 55% of fruits and vegetables. We have, like I mentioned, over 1,500 non-native plant species here. So if you're a bug that needs a certain plant or an animal that needs a certain plant to survive, or if you're a certain plant that gets introduced to our environment, it could be a bad thing. And then, we don't have a lot of freezes to prevent, knockback of invasive species, except for this year, which we've noticed in our roundup and just sort of walking around as well. I haven't seen too many big iguanas like I have in previous years. But to give you about the scale, then we also have a lot of hurricanes, escapees, and a lot of disturbed habitats. By definition, invasives originate from humans, because we introduced them. So, these disturbed habitats that are created, like gated communities and what have you, pushed out our native flora and fauna and allowed a blank canvas for non-native species to get a foothold in if they become released. Give you an idea of scale, it's about a $500 million a year impact to our state's economy. About 179,000 or 179 million is just agricultural damage that invasive species create. We spend about 45 to 50 million alone on aquatic weed control. So it costs us money. And usually the person who introduced the invasive species is not the one who's paying for it. It's all of us. So up to us to educate, up to us to report, and tell other folks to not release their pets or think about maybe Florida friendly options for landscaping. So, without further ado, we're going to go into some species profiles. And these usually have some fun stories when I'm in a room because, these are ones that I see in my area down here in Collier County. And folks kind of show me pictures afterwards of, a Burmese python taking out an ibis. And you're like, oh, wow, that's pretty unique. But we'll talk about some of the ones that you might have seen in headlines and in your backyard and then go further. So, Burmese python, first introduced in 1979. They're from Southeast Asia. That's where Burma is, which I believe is like the Myanmar area. They like swamps. And where are there swamps in our state? What about the giant Everglades that's directly east to me? They're introduced by the pet trade. There was a big push that we're importing them in the 70s and then again in the 90s. Why were they imported? Well, they look pretty. You might see the snakeskin pattern on a lot of bags out there, and they're actually pretty docile in terms of, a large constrictor, not so much like a rock python or a reticulated python that might be pretty aggressive. I've seen people just sort of handle, a snake in the wild and not getting them bit, but, make sure you have the danger part, which is the head. They get about 18 to 20 feet long, 100 pounds plus. I just mentioned the plus part because it's pretty much a tube of whatever is inside of it. That's how much more it's going to weigh. And there's a story about a 31-pound python eating a 35-pound deer. So is that now a 66-pound python or is that still a 31-pound python? Females get bigger than males, oftentimes like the biggest ones out there, I believe are about 20, 18 feet or so, about 150 to 180 pounds. Those might have been ones that had eggs that actually, have a little bit of weight because they could lay about 50 to 100 eggs. They're active during the day or night, depending on season. If it's a cool night in a sunny morning, they might be found basking. If it's a warm night and a warm, rainy night, they might be moving around at nighttime trying to eat all the frogs and the things trying to eat the frogs on the road. They eat mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. They just sit there and wait. They don't have to worry about picking up their kids from school or anything. So they're just sitting there waiting to ambush different kind of prey items. It's been known, I have a stat here that they've been they eat up to 76 different prey items, 48 birds, 26 mammals, two reptiles. And it's really hard to quantify how many amphibians they eat because those don't really stay great in stomach contents. They've been known to eradicate up to 88 to 100% of the small mammal population in certain areas of the Everglades, like Big Cypress National Park. Um, they are also, damage to humans. There hasn't been anybody eaten by one of these. They can bite you, but 90% of the times, if you walk the opposite direction of a snake, you are 100% safe. So most people, who are getting bitten are directly, interacting with these things. Damage to humans, though, they've known to like eat pets. There's some people that, might have a goat or two missing in the Collier County area. Ecologically damaging, we mentioned all the different prey items they ate and like how the decline of mammals in the Everglades. And economically, what's that cost to our state's economy in terms of management costs, research costs, and even, what price do we put on like a raccoon? That's that headline that you can see that 35-pound deer and a 31-pound snake. That's pretty impressive. And then this is all the prey items that are supposedly needed to get a snake up to 13 feet long in about 5 to 7 years. So 5 foot, 4 or 5 foot alligators, American coots, all these the kind of diversity that you would see, but now inside one organism in that snake. Yeah. So red lionfish. Who here is eating red lionfish? I have, Mike. Okay, cool. What do you think about it? It's great. So they taste great. There's very little red on them. This is Pterois volitans, like Pterois, like pterodactyl has that P in there. So they use their big winged pectoral fins to funnel stuff in their mouth. There's about 500 species in the Scorpionidae family. Not all of them are lionfish. But there's three genuses of lionfish. There's Pterois, Parapterois, and Dendrochirus. So whenever you hear somebody say, "Oh, lionfish are bad," if you want to be that guy, you could say, "Which species of lionfish are you talking about?" They're always talking about this one, which is the red lionfish. But there's actually one other species in the Gulf and Atlantic called Pterois miles, but only about 2 or 3% of that population out there is Pterois miles. They look very similar. They're from the Indo-Pacific, introduced in 1985. Wait, that's before Hurricane Andrew. Yeah, so they were here before Hurricane Andrew, where a lot of people thought they were introduced from there. But, Hurricane Andrew might have introduced more individuals, which is sort of important for genetic diversity and biodiversity, right? So a lot of times these invasive species, they might have not been like 10,000 invasive pythons released. It could have been handfuls of them, right? Same thing with lionfish, but by adding more individuals, you're making more of genetic robustness, right? Because there's been conditions where these lionfish have broke out with like this ulcerative disease that leaves lesions on their skin. And it might be because they share very similar genetics to each other, because they're all cousins and brothers and sisters. There might have been dozens of introductions, not hundreds of introductions. So every new introduction, it helps prevent, maybe that disease from eradicating the whole population. They get about 3 pounds. That's a big one. Why are they bad? They're venomous. They have 18 venomous spines, but everybody listening to this presentation right now is completely safe from a lionfish. You have to really instigate them as a diver to get stung by them. It's not necessarily deadly, but everybody's internal biology is a little bit different. It just hurts really bad. I got stung a couple times. Why are they bad? Venomous human damage. That's the invasive definition. Damage to humans, economy, and environment. Damage to the environment. They eat anything that fits in their mouth that's slow, that they could catch up to and just funnel in there, including, juvenile, really important reef species that people pay a lot of money to catch, as well as reef grazing species. What if you're a little fish that like cleans the algae and now you're not there because the lionfish eats you? Coral can't grow on that rock anymore, right? And then economically damaging. A lot of people pay money to enjoy, fishing in here. That can be damaging in that way. We spend a lot of money to try to manage them as well. They live in live bottom and wrecks. They could lay up to 15 to 30,000 eggs in two gelatinous masses almost weekly in some areas, not necessarily like Massachusetts where they've been spotted, but if they're in Jamaica, maybe they're making a lot more babies than, some other colder areas. So they could be reproductive in their first year of life. They live about 10 to 15 years in captivity. They live in depths of up to 1,000 degrees, or no, 1,000 feet. Tolerate temperatures of up to as low as 50 degrees and handle salinities as low as 4 parts per thousand. And that's not necessarily like, oh, I'm going to make a lot of babies in this. But remember, what if you get sucked up in a ship ballast water? Which that's not where they thought these were introduced. But all those conditions make it like pretty good that you could, maybe be taken care of by a novice fish tank person in terrible conditions that other fish would die. And now through that neglect, somebody just dumps the tank, right? So that's the kind of theory of that. But in depths of up to 1,000 feet, no recreational diver is going to go in there. So that lionfish removal is great because it brings awareness, establish new industries, but we're never going to eradicate them alone from that mechanical removal of sending a diver down there. Green iguana, we talked about them briefly, but they're from Central and South America, observed in the pet trade. This is another one of these kind of tank buster effects. That's something that you might see quoted of why these things are getting introduced. That Burmese python, you get it when it's a foot long. Oh, it's so cute. What if it's 20 feet? What if it's 15 feet now? And your mom's going to tell you to get rid of it, right? Lionfish, you have it in a tank. Oh, it's so cute, so good, right? Oh, it starts eating all your tank mates that you spent a lot of money and time putting in that tank, so you're gonna dump it. Iguana, oh, it's tiny, mom, right? And now it gets 4 feet long. What am I gonna do with it? Tank buster effect. Either stuff that doesn't fit in a tank anymore or might not live in cohabitation with your other tank mates. First observed in 64, introduced by the pet trade, get about 5 feet long, 17 pounds. They're mostly, omnivorous-ish when they're young. And a lot of times as stuff gets older, it switches to like a more maintenance diet of eating more herbivory. That's why I see the big ones grazing on the side of the road, but they could eat insects, invertebrates. They've been known to eat like a tree snail that's semi-endangered and like a Miami or a flower that the Miami blue butterfly can host on, which is a semi-endangered butterfly, I believe. So a lot of our native critters can do that too, but in terms of invasive impacts, damage to humans, economy, environment, not so much an environmental damage. It's not good that you see so many of them, but more of a nuisance to people where they pay lots of money for people to remove them. There's the economic side. They've been known to degrade seawalls, maybe not so much this species, but we also have the Mexican spiny tail iguana and the black spiny tail iguana that are more ground dwelling and like burrowing. They've damaged some electrical infrastructure. But mostly people don't like them eating their landscaping that they pay a lot of money for. They might be afraid of them. They might not have like a pool deck or a pool cage where these animals can poop along the deck and cause some sort of, nasty disease kind of transmission. Um, and yeah, in these pictures, you'll see the EDMAPS version of where they've been spotted and the native range of some of these critters. Hey, cane toads. This is the number one cold call received questions I get as an extension agent is what's this in my backyard? And a lot of times it's a cane toad, right? So we actually have four toads that are in the Bufonidae family. The southern toad, which is this one that's most easily mistaken as a cane toad. The oak toad, um, the spadefoot, I believe. There's another one, but long story short, our native species have evolved with a member of the Bufonidae family, which they're, more accustomed to the poison. So this isn't venom, it's poison. It has to be ingested or go through some sort of barrier. Venom is something like that lionfish or a bite or a sting that has to get sort of through. It can't be, you could probably ingest a venom and be okay, but if you ingest the poison, you're not, right? So. These were introduced in 1936 by being biological control. So, intentional introduction, eat the sugarcane beetle. But if you ever seen sugarcane, it's 10 feet tall, and these toads are tiny. So, or not tiny, they're about 6 inches long. That's a big one, but they're not tall. So they would need lots of toad ladders or hop on their backs to get to the very top. So that didn't work. So they think they were more established through that multiple introductions, like I mentioned, is bad because more genetics, more biodiversity in that kind of population. Um, through the pet trade, like if you see like Harry Potter, you see that big toad, cane toad in there. They get about 6 to 9 inches long. Any toad over 4 inches is a cane toad in Florida, and we ask folks if they choose to eradicate them or remove them from their property to make sure they know that it's a cane toad and not our southern toad. So the cane toads have these larger parotoid glands, big triangular ones, and a lack of a neural crest, which is the southern toad, which is the most mistaken one, right? So if it's smooth and it has these bigger glands, it's a cane toad. If it's over 4 inches, it's a cane toad, and you can kill it. There's recommendations on how to do that online. Color is not a good indicator because they can vary greatly in color. They're active during the day or night, depending on what stage. In the daytime, it's mostly little individuals, right? And then at nighttime, mostly bigger individuals. And they think that they evolved that to not get eaten by their parents because they don't really have great eyesight. They'll just eat anything that's small that's hopping in front of them. So let's not eat your kids. Let's have these different ontogenetic habitats that they have. They're omnivorous, they like eating bugs and stuff, but they could eat, small mammals, they could eat small snakes, pretty much anything that hops in front of their face. And if you keep one in a bucket for a while, you'll see all like the leaves and stuff they poop out because they're just eating anything that, can land on something. They're in urban and suburban areas. They lay about 8 to 30,000 eggs twice per year. That's, when the rain starts and it's nice and warm, you'll hear them cooling, and it's actually a very nice sound. But why are they invasive? Damage to humans. Not so much, but damage to like, our pets that are considered almost humans, they affect us drastically. Our, dogs and cats have not evolved with a Bufonidae toad. A black racer could potentially eat one, a crow can eat one, be okay. But our dog and cat, they're hardwired to chase something that's small that's in front of them. So people ask me like, "Oh, is my dog in trouble? Like, how big's your dog and how big's this cane toad and how much does it have access to this toad?" Because their defense is almost like a dead hand switch. Well, they don't shoot this poison out. You have to really press on it. So that usually is like an animal chewing on it, and then they, get impacted from those glands. And they live 10 to 15 years in captivity. But damage to the environment, they're bad, but most oftentimes you see these in gated communities and residential and retention ponds and detention ponds. So in the middle of the Everglades, you'd be hard find to find a cane toad. These retention ponds are shallow bodies of water with street lights all over the place that are like vending machines. As the bug hits the light, falls down, the cane toad eats it. And then damage to the environment, like I mentioned, they're damaging the economy. People actually pay money for people to go out and trap these toads, so that's some good job security for those trappers. Okay, so Brazilian pepper, we're getting away from animals, and we got a couple more slides of plants, and then sort of what you guys can do. We're running lower on time, so I want to make sure I get through everything. But Brazilian pepper, we spend a lot of money as a state on controlling non-native plants. We're not spending tens of millions of dollars on iguana control as a state. Maybe municipalities or homeowners are paying that, money overall, combined. But, we're spending, I believe, let's see. $45 million to control invasive species on conservation of the lands alone. So this is the second most coverage of any invasive plant out there. The first one, I believe, is Congan grass that covers over 1 million acres. This covers about 700,000 acres. Brazilian peppers from South America, Argentina, Brazil. They believe there was a couple introductions of like an East Coast and a West Coast population in Florida, and now those are sort of hybridizing a little bit, causing more vigor than you would see in sort of the native range Brazilian peppers as well. Observed in the late 1800s, naturalized in 1950s. They're in over 20 counties, I said countries there, counties in Florida, about 700,000 acres, damaging to, okay, so why are they invasive? Damage to humans. They're in the same family as poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac. So if you are cutting them down, you can get that sap on you, and people have a negative reaction to it. I'm pretty good with it, but everybody varies a little bit. Damage to the economy. We spend, like I mentioned, tens of millions of dollars conserving natural areas from species like these. Damage to the environment. They have allelopathic effects where they kill everything in the understory that's around them that, can't compete with them. They've been known to even live in areas where mangroves are prevalent. So, we need our mangroves for our coastal buffers and our storm surge buffers, and now Brazilian peppers can live there. Why were they introduced? Well, they're ornamental. Sometimes I believe they were called Christmas berry because around Christmas time, that's where you can see the red berries that the female plant has. So they're dioecious, meaning that there's both male and female plants. The male plants won't produce the berries, but they'll produce the pollen. Berries start happening around December time, Christmas berry time. But robins have been known to be a big distributor of them, and the seed viability gets a little bit better as it gets ingested and sort of the seed coat disintegrates. And there's about 66 to 100% seedling survival rate after it's digested by, a bird that is one of the biggest carriers of this invasive species. And what are we doing about it? Well, there's some biological control, and we sort of talked about the negative consequences of biological control with cane toads back in the 30s, but they're a little bit more loose with let's go ahead and try it. But nowadays, when they introduce biological control, they do years and years and years and years of studies with it, and they introduce this thrift that actually eats new leaves, not necessarily kills the plant, but a lot of times the fruit the berries that you see are on new growth, so that might affect their reproductive capability. That allows us to go ahead and, control it easier because it's not actively making itself, right? Then there's also another thing called a Brazilian pepper yellow leaf caller, where the little nymphs live inside the leaves, reducing the photosynthetic capacity of this plant. Once again, affecting new growth. Maybe it doesn't become reproductively active with this increased stress. Maybe that combined with cold damage, combined with us actually trying to manage it, could allow us to get a better foothold on controlling this invasive species. And then, I've got this from a paper out there that says Brazilian pepper, pretty much as well as Australian pine, is one of the greatest threats to native beach vegetation, which, gets it on all fronts from hurricanes to people trampling on it to invasive species affecting beach vegetation that affects erosion, which a lot of people come here for our beaches. So, Australian pine. This is an interesting one because I've actually had municipalities and homeowners are like, hey, I don't want my Australian pines gone, but the state says I have to remove them if I'm going to create, this kind of new development or new building that I want to do. Well, they're bad. They're not from here. We're not in Australia. We're in Florida. And there's three different species. There's Casuarina, Equistifolia, Cunninghamia, and Glauca. So the most common one is Equistifolia, Cunninghamia is ish, and then Glauca is the one of the ones that is also really bad. But if you are aware of the cassowary bird in Australia, the one that has like the blue head and the big crest and looks really dangerous, well, that's where that comes from because it has those little bristles. And then equistifolia, equus is a horse, and then folia is like plant. So they say that the leaves sort of resemble, they are like stems with modified leaves, not actually needles like pine trees. These aren't actually pine trees, resemble like horsehair bristles. Like I mentioned, there's the three different species. I think this is Equistifolia, Cunninghamia, and Glauca, most common. But this Glauca I want to have a good representation of is because they send out suckers, which makes it harder to manage as well. Instead of like having to have a seed germinate, they could just send more of them through the ground and start popping up. But observed in the 1800s, naturalized in the 30s and 40s, damage to humans. Why are they bad? They look so pretty. Well, they are some of the first ones to fall during hurricanes, right? And if you have a house with trees falling around, you don't want that tree to fall on your house. They also have allelopathic effects, where if you ever see the understory of Brazilian or Australian pine areas, it's just pine needles. They're or pine needles. There's, nothing underneath them, right? Reducing biodiversity, damage to the economy. It's going to cost a lot of money getting that tree off your house. Damage to the environment. They can, they're monoecious, which means they both have male and female parts in the same flower. Their seeds can be viable for up to 1 year. They could float in salt water for up to 3 weeks and germinate in salt water. So that's bad because we need our saltwater environments to be natural, like I mentioned. And these that create better erosion kind of conditions is not a good thing for our coastal ecosystems. They get really big, mostly mechanical and herbicide kind of removal. And yeah. And oh, one bad thing is their seeds start happening around hurricane season. So you can imagine that's a really good way of distributing a lot of seeds at one time as heavy winds and tides and stuff moving around. So that's the needle. It looks like a modified whorl over there. It's actually a stem, I think, covered in leaves that are like that. That's the understory of Brazilian or the Australian pine, not that much diversity. And this is after Hurricane Andrew. You can see all the Australian pine trees that fell. And if only 4% of this Cunningham questifolia, which is that Australian pine tree, were standing after Hurricane Andrew compared to 66% of native trees. So we want our native trees in our coastal areas. Okay, so one more and then I'll go into some other stuff. Tilapia. I only mentioned this because a lot of people are like, tilapia, like that's just one thing, but that's like saying I got dog, like what kind of dog is there? There's so many different species of tilapia. Tilapia, there's about 100 species of tilapia from the Middle East and Africa. They're a type of cichlid. There's also South American cichlids, like those little angelfish and Oscars and stuff that you see at the pet stores. Those are cichlids. These are cichlids from the Middle East and Africa. There are potentially six species that are in Florida. The big ones are the blues and then the Niles. So Niles have these distinct bars. So I could go into it in more, but anything over about 4 pounds is probably going to be a blue tilapia. Introduced mostly for the food trade. Then there's other ones like the spot tilapia, the black chin tilapia, the Mozambique tilapia, the hornet, and the red belly tilapia. So there's about six species of tilapia in here. They're detritivores a lot of times. They might eat plants and plankton and small organisms. Some are more different than others. Like the spot tilapia you can catch on hook and line. The blue and the Nile tilapia, they're more detritivores. They eat algae and stuff. And why would it be bad to eat algae? Right? Don't we want less algae? Well, there's a lot of algae out there, so there's lots of food for them. And it's been known that like some areas in the Florida Springs, about 86% of the fish biomass has been just tilapia. So if you're 86% of all the fish that are in the water body that aren't from here, that's probably bad, right? They also, compete for nesting habitat with our native fish around edges of ponds. In the middle of the ocean, not that many stuff is spawning, but on the edges of these areas where it's, rocky and sand and all that kind of place. These fish that can get up to 10 pounds, the blue tilapia, can be competing with like a 1 pound bluegill for the same kind of nesting habitat. Not good, even though they won't eat them because they eat like a lot of algae and smaller kind of plankton and stuff. They could be aggressive and, like I mentioned, one good characteristic of invasive species is sometimes they're great parents, and these are great parents. While the female versions of these ones will have the fish in their mouth, the babies in their mouth, and the male version of the black chin tilapia, which this species can live in almost full strength seawater. Lots of diversity, lots of places where this family of fish could take hold. We have no native cichlids in Florida, but that's some of the most speciose family of fish in the Everglades. There is one native cichlid to the United States called the Rio Grande cichlid. We're not there. They're not really so much here, but tilapia are cichlids, Oscars, Mayan cichlids, all those ones. And they're bad. They're just depending on species and your scale of what's good or bad or what's important for you. But like I mentioned, invasive species are ones that cause damage to the environment, humans, or economy. So what's happening now? We're getting a firmer awareness of the issue. We're getting a firmer grasp of what these things can do by observing what's already been done to our ecosystem. So, hey, maybe we don't allow rock pythons to be imported anymore because we know what a Burmese python can do. We're changing legislation. So, hey, if this hurricane's coming and you have a reptile concern that's now probably prohibited, but if you had it before you're grandfathered in, you have to put that snake in a bag inside a cage. So if the cage gets flooded, the snake can't just swim away, right? There's restoration efforts. Like I mentioned, a lot of these are by people because by definition, people had to introduce them, but they're also taking advantage of those disturbed ecosystems, right? So restoring it can maybe bring back more native function. We're getting better at research. We're doing early detection, rapid response. We're having sentinels. We have biological control. We have camera traps. We have cane toad traps. We have a bunch of traps. So what can you do? You could get involved. You could report sightings of non-native species. Like I mentioned, early detection, rapid response is the next best method of management after eradicate or after prevention. So prevention is cheaper, isolate it, know where we are next, and once it becomes established, it's sort of a problem that's here to stay. You can volunteer with FWC, like we have. We're part of the Southwest Florida SISMA. SISMA is CISMA, which stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. There are SISMAs throughout the state, and I'll show you one event that here in Southwest Florida, our SISMA puts on. So if you want to get involved with invasive species outreach, education, management, you could talk to your SISMA. You can attend trainings and roundups. You could become a state contractor and remove Burmese pythons. Sort of a futile effort of removing them in terms of eradication, but make a couple extra bucks, spread invasive species awareness, and have some cool stories about it. There's exotic pet amnesty days. You can, if you have a turtle you don't want anymore, you don't have to dump them in that pond. You could give it to FWC and they'll find a home for it. There's self-removal of these things. You could think naturally, doing Florida-friendly landscaping instead of, having the 1,500 plants that aren't from here living here. You could have one of our native ones that could be lower on, irrigation demands, more resilient to disease, homes for our native animals and pollinators out there. UF has some great resources I could share with you later. And then, there's home exclusion tips. So you can make your house less cane toad friendly, but, we won't really eradicate them using just mechanical means. So, if you have that issue or concern, you can trim your plants up higher, install bug lights. You can remove standing bodies of water and, make it less likely that as soon as your dog runs out, it won't grab a cane toad. And then educate yourself and others. So, I was sort of invited to do this talk based on our event the Southwest Florida SISMA puts on. Like I mentioned, the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. We host this every springtime because that's the driest part of the year, which makes all these fish consolidated in the bodies of water that are still around. We get thousands of fish each year. As you can see, this year we had 109 anglers, 105 anglers bringing over 5,437 fish for 3,920 pounds. That's pretty impressive judging by that cold front that we had that killed a lot of these things too. But we know, like I mentioned, that mechanical removal isn't going to solve anything completely. We've seen anecdotal evidence of people eradicating them almost from their local water body, but not, as a statewide level, maybe making better kind of band-aid effects on that small pond that they have that's closed off from other ecosystems. But we do cool research with them in education. So we have about 8 or 10 education stations each year. We have 50 volunteers from 20 different organizations this year that helped out. So Army Corps of Engineers had a booth, USGS, FWC, a whole bunch of things. We do mercury content analysis with them to provide better freshwater consumption recommendations of seafood. We do composting work with them to provide alternative uses for invasive species if you don't want to eat them. A lot of good stuff out there. And if you want to get involved, feel free to reach out to me. We always need prize donations and volunteers. Next year this will start back up in April or May. We usually choose to either the last week in April or first week of May to do it. And then we have a nice little Facebook group that has pictures of a lot of our research that we've done, from the composting work to the growth studies to what even the event looked like this year. Really quickly, this is the I've Got One app. You should download it. It's fun. You can see what kind of invasives are in your area. It's like a little Pokemon Go. You could click on these categories and see like a picture repository of what each one of these could look like. So if you click wildlife, you click lizard, you can see all these things to know, hey, what is this in my backyard? And you could log it and help out, researchers know, the spread of these invasive species. And that's sort of what we do in our roundup as well. We disclose the locations to managers so they can calculate, where they've been to. That's a invasive resource document that I'll go ahead and also include the link in a follow-up email, or give it to Keep Florida Beautiful, because I will end with this. Oh, okay. One more before I end. It's the new normal. You might have heard that a lot during the pandemic. There's expanding ranges. If it's in Florida and you could live a little bit colder, what are the likelihoods of you going to Georgia coming up? Probably pretty high, since we have a good ornamental plant trade where some species like Cuban tree frogs just hide in plants that get distributed all throughout the coastal states and become established potentially. There's emerging industries, there's python hunters. This is one of my favorite pictures. It says, buy local, whole caught wild lionfish. Well, they're not in the Pacific, so why would this be local? Oh, it's an invasive species. Be proactive than reactive. That's what our state's doing with preventing them from becoming established. It's not just reptiles, amphibians, birds, like we just mentioned. Some of the most impactful ones are plants that can alter entire ecosystems rather than, this predator-prey interaction stuff. It's not their fault they're here, it's ours. By definition, we brought them here, so don't be cruel to them if you do decide to remove them. Do it with as much kindness as you can. Support research, and it's up to everyone to make a difference. So with that, that is me. I would ask if you could please take that QR code, scan. It's a quick evaluation that helps me sort of say, hey, I talked to so many people and they found it helpful, and makes me stay here a couple more years until maybe AI replaces me. Who knows? But yeah, if you could do that, there's a link in the description too. I'll go ahead and send it in a big group to you guys, and then that is a QR for some of my programs. We have a Florida Society of Ethical Ecotourism webinar series popping up, and just June 17th. That's the first one on marine things that sting. I will be the presenter for that one as well. If you'd like to hear my rambling here, you can hear me talk about things that sting you. And then there's good links to our fish roundup if you scroll further down, our Facebook pages, all sorts of stuff. And that's my individual position here in Collier County, but we do some statewide programs as well. But feel free to give me a call, an email, contact me if you would like to get involved in the roundup, if you have any questions. And with that, I'll take any questions.
And then I also put the link for you guys in the chat. But you can drop your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask Michael.
Yeah, it's Katie with Keep County Beautiful. I didn't really have any questions, but I wanted to tell you that I really did enjoy today's presentation, and I've learned quite a bit, and I'm right now sitting at my phone loading some apps. So
Nice.
I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Today was a really good lecture series.
Oh, I appreciate the kind words. Thank you. Let's see if we got any more over here.
Just some
Sword
thank
fern,
yous.
cats. Two more armored catfish here in Central Florida. Okay, so that's a good one, right? So armored catfish. Catfish are some of the most diverse species of vertebrates on Earth. There's about 6,500 species of catfish out there. I believe like 1 in 20 things that have a spine is a species of catfish in terms of that. So there's ones that live, in all sorts of niches along the world, and they have those characteristics, like having those armored plates. There's different kind of species of catfish that are armored. There's like the plecos, right? That's like sort of like a colloquial kind of term. Then there's like the hoplo catfish, but mostly the sucker mouth kind of plecos. There's the Amazon vermiculated and Orinoco here. They eat algae and detritus, and why is that bad? Well, if that's why people buy them for their fish tank. I'm going to eat all the fish food that's on the bottom. Well, with catfish that if you eat low on the food chain, those algae and whatever, there's lots of food for you. You're going to blow up in numbers. And then, like catfish, they like to also burrow, and they burrow in these canal banks, and they create these holes that are great when like the water level's high. But when that water level is dropping, those holes become exposed to the air. That hydrostatic pressure keeping them open collapses them, and it causes a lot of shoreline erosion that affects the infrastructure, how that canal bank is operating. It's affecting, maybe even water visibility and clarity by suspending solids in there. And marine construction is very expensive, so that is one reason why armored catfish are bad.
And then Michael Stewart asks, are we keeping up with Python numbers? How's that looking?
No, that's so I have 17 snakes at home. I am very well versed on what these things can do. A lot of people, where are you cruising? You're cruising the roads. Those pythons don't need roads. They're just chilling, on like a piece of exposed land that's in the middle of the Everglades, like a little oak hammock or a cypress dome. Um, yeah, it's going to be really hard to remove them that way. There's a lot of thoughts of like people talking about removal of invasive species, like through like genetic manipulation and what have you. They'll say, well, we can make super males, and if you have YY super male genes and the females are all XX, then you'll make XY all offspring, and that's just going to breed them out of existence, right? Well, do we know the sex determination and chromosomal type of pythons? I don't. Maybe we could find that out pretty easy, but some things like fish don't really have sex chromosomes. They just have maybe a certain amount of characteristics that gets triggered that make them more male or female, right? But there's also like the ZZ-ZW system where males are homozygous instead of females are that XX homozygous. So we might get closer with maybe like genetic manipulation if we could identify, the chromosomal type or maybe like inserting some sort of disease. But by mechanical removal, no, not so much because they could just be anywhere. The big thing about that hunt is really like it brings awareness, gets a lot of eyes on invasive species to know more about the issue. Maybe we'll start a leather industry. I've worked with other groups like Inversa Leather that created python leather. People are thinking of eating them too, all sorts of different kind of potential mechanisms for control. But it's one of those, once they're here, they're sort of here kind of critters.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions before Michael has to hop off?
No problem.
And even if you come up with one later, we'll attach his contact and everything so you guys can email him should anything come up.
Yeah.
But
Start
all
a
right.
roundup in your neighborhood too. Get involved with
Yeah.
the SISMA. Board-friendly landscaping, report invasives. Don't release your pets.
Yeah.
Spay
Exactly.
and neuter them. I don't know.
All right. Well, I think that is all, Michael. Thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing. And yeah, if you could just send me this after your next meeting whenever you have time, I'll make sure all the affiliates get it. And send them that link as well again.
Okay, yeah, I forgot I have a too. Okay. See you guys. Thank you.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.